Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mike Swetnam, the CEO and chairman here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and it's my honor to welcome you here to the Institute today for another lively discussion on the issues of terrorism and combating terrorism and extremists around the world. As most of you know, I believe, we're privileged here at the Institute to have the International Center for the Study of Terrorism run by Professor Yona Alexander, which is affiliated with think tanks and universities around the world. We think it's one of the world's foremost center for the academic study of terrorism and related issues. Yona publishes at least 4, 5, 6 books a year, holds a dozen seminars here at the Institute and another half dozen around the world, and Yona's contributions are phenomenal, and I think you'll agree something that we're glad to have in this time when the issues of terrorism concern us all to the point that they do. He's going to tell you a little bit more about his center and about the many publications that have been coming out recently. I'm just going to highlight one because I'm part of it. It's where Yona and I put together translations of all of the writings of Osama bin Laden as kind of a quick reference on all that he said, and it's still in publication review at the CIA, or else we'd release it here today. They're worried about what bin Laden said, as they probably should be. So I get to, Yona has me down to make some opening remarks, and I thank you very much for that, Yona. As I walked in today, he mentioned to me that what we really need today is clarity. And I was reminded recently at a home we have overseas with my wife that she prescripted me into the duties that I'm best suited for, which was washing the windows. And she came across one of the back windows, which was worse than many of the others that had been scratched and abused by a tree that brushes up against it. And she said, "Clean the window." So I got all the right implements and washed the window. And when I was all done, she said, "I still can't see through that window for all the scratches and everything. You're obviously not rubbing hard enough. Get some more alcohol, put a little more elbow grease into that window," and I did. And lo and behold, in my normal way, I pushed my hand through the window, shattered it, pieces of glass all across the floor. And she said, "Now see what you've done." But I noted to her, "But see how clear the view is?" So in that way, I'm going to try and answer Yona's call today about bringing clarity to this situation. If I don't break a window in the next 2 or 3 minutes, well, I'm sure that our speakers, and we have some of the best possible here today, will bring some clarity to the situation. I have a couple comments. The first is a comment about being at war. And I start it with a question. How many people have to declare war for you to be at war? Do both sides have to declare war and agree that they're at war, or does only one side have to agree that they're at war? In the early 1990s, Osama bin Laden announced to the public and in writing and in many speeches that followed over a decade that he was at war with the United States. He proved it by attacking a couple of our embassies and finally blowing up one of our warships. And it wasn't until 1991, when he attacked us here in the homeland, that we finally caught on that we were at war with him. He declared war with us almost 12 years before he hit us on 9/11, and it took us 12 years to realize we were at war. But we were at war that entire time. Today, Daesh, ISIS, ISIL, whatever you want to call them, has written and publicly announced that they are at war, not just with the West, but specifically with the United States and France. Are we at a state of war with them? Well, of course we are. And we can ignore it, or we can push it aside, or we can say that, no, this is just another crazy group overseas. But the fact is, when one group with the powers like a nation state declares war on you, you're at war. We're at war. Second comment is, who are we at war with? It's been debated and argued in political circles and in commentaries on TV for the last several weeks over and over again. Are we at war with the extremists? Are we at war with Islam? Are we at war with Syria? Are we at war with what's left of the Iraq government? Who exactly are we at war with? Well, I would contend to you today that we're not at war with any of those things. We are at war with an ideology. In the last several centuries, every major world conflict has been over ideology. Ideology. In World War II, we weren't at war with the German people. We weren't at war with the Italian people or the Japanese people. We were at war with an ideology called fascism, Nazism, extremism. It was democracy against fascism. So I contend today, and I will put it out today as my version of breaking the glass, that in defining the current conflict, let's start with the fact that, one, we're at war, and two, it's an ideological war. It's a war over ideologies. Democracy versus a theocracy, a caliphate. It's a different way of looking at the world. We have an ideological war here, just like we had in World War II, and like it or not, we will have to fight it. So in putting together or thinking about a strategy, if you will, for approaching this war that we have no choice about, let's start with by understanding that unless we find a way, a process, a strategy to attack and defeat the ideology, we will not have a chance of winning. Talking about defeating radicalism, or talking about defeating some part of some religion, or talking about defeating some leftover dictator in Syria will not get us to the end point. The end point will be in addressing a corrupt ideology that we're at war with. I hope that's broken the glass. If not, I apologize and try a little bit harder next time. Let me once again introduce the person that all of you know, Professor Yonah Alexander.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, particularly, I think, providing a context to what we're going to really discuss and provide a clarity in terms of who the enemies are and what should we do about this. And incidentally, again, we would be delighted to provide you with a copy of a report we just received. This is an advanced copy on Syria. Again, you mentioned that. The other publication, it's a Blue Ribbon, I think, report with Joe Lieberman and Tom Ridge and some other people to deal with the bio of threat, because the worst is yet to come, and we know the reports came out about the chemical and biological threat and all that. But at any rate, we try to provide some sort of context. There are two things I would like to say before we introduce our distinguished speaker, but let me first introduce the speakers in general. One to your right, I think, is Honorable Robert McFarlane. As you know, he was the former National Security Advisor to President Reagan. He worked with President Ford, and he contributed greatly to the national security and global security concerns of the United States. Next to him is Dr. Dov Zakheim, again, with very distinguished service to the U.S., a former Undersecretary of Defense and DOD civilian coordinator for Afghanistan, and involved in many academic activities, all the way CSIS and so on. Next to him is General Retired Keith Steckler from the U.S. Marine Corps, a former commanding general in a number of locations, all the way from Hawaii to North Carolina, and is currently a senior fellow and a member of the Board of Regents of the Potomac Institute. Next to him is Dr. Judith Yaffe, a former senior analyst at the CIA dealing with the Middle East and South Asia. She is currently a professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at GW. And last is Professor Dean Alexander, who is the director of the Homeland Security Research Program at the State University of Illinois, and is involved in law enforcement and justice administration. So I think we have a very distinguished panel, but before that, let me welcome our audience right here, the audience of former U.S. and also current U.S. officials from various government executive agencies, also foreign governments, ambassadors, and diplomats. Then, of course, the academics, as we know, some of the journalists, and last our next generation of scholars and specialists, the students, interns, undergraduate, and graduate, and I think their contribution is very important. Tragically, we have to mention, as always, the memory of those who dedicated themselves to the fight of terrorism. First of all, the victims all the way from Ankara to Amman, to Baghdad, to Beirut, Brussels, and Bamako, and Jerusalem, etc., etc. I think we have to also acknowledge the contributions of those at various nations, international organizations who are contributing to combat terrorism. In fact, if we look at this bloody list of those who were killed in Paris, there are some 18 nationalities, not only the French, but there is a U.S. Student by the name Gonzalez, 23, who was killed in Paris. She went to study in Paris and not to expect a terrorist attack there. And of course, there are many nationalities who were killed. Or if we look at Mali, what's happening there, again with the hostage situation and dozens of people who were killed. Again, an American by the name of Amita, who actually from Tacoma Park in Maryland, and she was an international development worker, and she was killed there. So again, if we look around the world, the victimization is growing by day. And the next time, I think the terrorists will take over not only a hotel or to attack restaurants and so on, they're going to take over entire cities and countries. So I think we're going to discuss that. And very quickly, in terms of the discussion that we have, I would like to remind all of us that terrorism is one of the many security considerations that we have to look at, and certainly there are some others. So again, we have to look at the nature of the threat. And secondly, we have to also remember that during the month of November, the anniversary dates, we have to remember what happened in the past and learn some of the lessons for the future. So the list is very long. Then again, we have to look at the map and see the growing, I think, capability, the intentions and capabilities of not only the Islamic State, the Caliphate without borders, but also the al-Qa'ida and other groups around the world. And finally, I think the key questions again and again and again, whether the worst is yet to come, whether civilization will survive, and can counterterrorism strategies or the war or whatever response we're going to develop can coexist with democratic values. So again, this is a balance between the security considerations and the civil liberties. Now we're going to move on, and we're going to invite Robert McFarland to provide a broader context.
I also want to thank Yonah, and I want to acknowledge General Gray. I don't think I know you as long, Al, as Bud does, but I know you a long time. And I've respected you every bit as much as Bud. General Gray, as you know, was Commandant of the Marine Corps and one of the finest people to wear the uniform that I know. In the few minutes that I have, I'd like to talk about first what we shouldn't be doing and then perhaps what we should. And I'm focusing entirely on ISIS. I agree we're at war. The problem is this country doesn't want to go to war. It's not just the president, it's the country. Because to go to war, you're going to need a lot more than what General Jack Keane, whom I also respect and who was dead right about the surge, says you need. I mean, if you look at what happened with the surge, that was 160,000 troops at its max. I don't think this country wants to do that. It's as simple as that. So that's one thing. And if you're not going to talk about, if you're not going to send that many troops, and you're not going to spend the money that goes with them, then maybe you shouldn't talk about going to war. Maybe you should talk about containment. Now, I know the administration talks about containment, but they're clearly not containing very much. They say they've rolled back ISIS, and they've gotten X amount of square miles back, most of which is desert. ISIS hasn't really lost a major city in months and months and months. And yes, there are now body counts again, as there were in Vietnam, how many ISIS people we killed, but they keep replenishing. And even more than the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, they replenish from all over the world. So the measures we're using are phony measures. If we're not going to defeat ISIS, and we're talking about containment, we ought to recognize that we shouldn't talk about defeating them, because if you're not defeating them, then they're winning, by definition. You've laid it out. You say, I'm going to defeat you guys. Every day they're around, they say, hey, we're not defeated. If you recall, Saddam Hussein in 1991 said, I won the war. Nobody else thought he won the war, but he felt he won the war because he was still there. Just being there, you know, when somebody says they're going to defeat you, means you haven't lost. But then we have to be serious about containing, and as I said, I'm not sure no, I am sure. We're not serious now. We are right now running about 1/7 the number of airstrikes we did in Libya, which wasn't exactly a major Alpha Strike campaign. The Russians have been far more intense and intensive when striking, and as Bud mentioned, and General Keane, the Russians don't have the same constraints on the rules of engagement that we do. So we're striking less, and we're tying one hand behind our backs as we do it. Our training is a disaster. There's something fundamentally wrong, and it goes beyond ISIS, quite frankly. Look at our record in Afghanistan. Something is wrong in the way we train others, at least in this part of the world. And we're going to need to look at that. But particularly in this case, we better stop exaggerating how well we're doing. And of course, the IG is busily digging up emails to nail people. But it's a larger question than one individual or several individuals exaggerating. The real issue is, look at the product. They run away. Who's armed ISIS? We armed ISIS with all the stuff that these people left behind. They don't even give us credit for it. As long as we don't have troops on the ground, and I don't know whether it's 10,000 or 15,000 or 5,000, I'll leave that to the military experts. That I trust them for that. And that's one other thing. We better stop questioning them every time they want to do something. But whatever the number is, there better be a larger number than 50. And it needs to be more than just special operations forces. We've got Rangers who can kick down doors too. We've got Marines who can kick down doors. We've got folks who can go in and out and do what Bud was mentioning. But until we've got them, forget about any regional support from the Arabs. It's hard enough when we are there. The last time we got major support from the Arab states was in 1991. I was responsible for running around the world trying to get help from the Arabs and others, both for Afghanistan and Iraq. It was not easy, and what we got was very, very limited in terms of their boots on the ground. And that was when we had over 100,000 troops in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So we need to be very, very cautious about assumptions about what the locals are going to do. But they certainly won't do very much at all if we're not in there showing that we're serious. Same thing about the Europeans. The only Europeans who are actually serious about knocking the heck out of ISIS are the French, because of what happened in Paris. Interesting, this was the second time it happened in Paris. First time it happened in Paris, the French didn't do very much. It took two to wake them up. The other Europeans who are doing a lot of the Russians. Nobody else, really. Canadians have just announced they're pulling out their half-dozen aircraft, this major force that they have there. But they're pulling them out. This is one of the first things Mr. Trudeau said. That doesn't exactly discourage ISIS. And finally, we need to get our heads straight about who we're going after first and whom we're not going after. Because unless we do that, nothing good will come out of it. What do I mean by that? The Turks' number one priority is, actually it's a tie for first, Kurds and Assad. They're tied for first. ISIS is less important to them. The Russians, their number one priority is to keep Assad. And now they're going after ISIS because of what happened over Sinai. The Israelis, their number one priority is Iran, because that's how Mr. Netanyahu got himself elected. And he wants to stay in power. He's got a majority of one, which isn't exactly huge. Many of the people whom we have worked with on the ground to fight ISIS actually want to fight Assad. So until we figure out what we want to do first, we're never going to get anywhere. I think that we need to focus on ISIS and basically swallow hard and say, look, we've been telling the world we're going to get rid of Assad for 4 years. He's still there. He's going to outlast our president, who wanted to get rid of him. So why don't we come to terms with that? Because that's the only way we're going to work alongside the Russians. And since the Russians don't have the same rules of engagement that we do, in this case, they're not a bad ally. By the way, we worked with some pretty mean Russians in World War II. If you want all your bedfellows to be perfect, then you're not going to have too many. So, who's worse, Mr. Putin or ISIS? If you think Mr. Putin's worse, fine, don't work with the Russians. So what should we be doing? As I already indicated, far more airstrikes than we've had. We've had, over Kobani, for example, we had intensive airstrikes. But then we ratcheted it down again. We have to maintain the pace. Number one. Wouldn't be bad to take a look at what the Russians are doing and try to emulate them as much as we can. We should be looking at the Russians as already something that shows you how far back we have fallen. We have to look at those guys instead of them looking at us. Secondly, let's stop kidding ourselves about how we help the Kurds. We can't help the Kurds as long as everything goes through in Iraq goes through Baghdad, and as long as we are in two minds in Syria because of Mr. Erdogan. There isn't very much Mr. Erdogan can do to us. There's a lot more we can do to him. Like, for instance, with his tottering economy, turn around and raise tariffs on everything he sells to us. There's stuff we can do to keep Mr. Erdogan. We've done it before, by the way. He didn't want to work with us at all, but we squeezed him. We can squeeze him. As long as we have this mantra of one Iraq and only help the Kurds by going through Baghdad, we are going to be creating a problem for ourselves. We cannot expect these people to work alongside us, and they are the toughest fighters. I mean, we haven't bothered to train them. They're pretty damn good on their own. They won't go beyond the territory they believe is theirs, but they will stop ISIS for moving into their territory. So that's part of containment. So we ought to arm them directly. We definitely have to revamp our training. The only way we can do that in the short term is to have more people on the ground. More people not only acting as spotters, but people with the units, because then they might be a little bit embarrassed when they want to run away. It'll buck them up. Again, I don't know if it's 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. It can't be a huge number because, again, the American public won't support it. I don't think it needs to be a huge number. Safe zones. Right now, we continue to oppose safe zones because we're afraid the Russians will confront us and penetrate the safe zones. The airspace in particular, but not just airspace. They could pull artillery up to an air zone, a safe zone and fire into it. Well, why would the Russians do that? The Russians will do it because we also say we're going to train the opposition in the safe zones. So you got to, again, choose. If you want to have safe zones and you don't want people running away from Syria, then you better decide not to train the opposition in those safe zones. And turn around to the Russians and say, fine, you can inspect. By the way, again, having the Arabs patrol the outer boundaries of the safe zone is not going to do it. Anyway, they're too tied up in that war in Yemen that's not going very well. So cut a deal with the Russians. Make it clear that these are humanitarian zones. And by the way, don't kid yourself. They're not going to be in Turkey. The Syrians don't want to go to Turkey unless they absolutely have to. The Jordanians can't take any more Syrians. They've got about 1 million or so. It's a small, poor country, for God's sake. So they have to be inside Syria, which in any event is more likely to keep the Syrians from running to Europe. What can we do in Jordan? One thing we can do is put some troops there. Make sure there are no incursions. If you're going to contain, you've got to keep them encircled and then slowly penetrate and make them shrink. So I would do that. Then there's one other thing we need to do. The whole problem is these young Arabs, they're not necessarily poor. Most, a lot of them are pretty well educated. 9/11 ones who perpetrated 9/11 weren't uneducated and poor. So we've got to reach out to them. It's not going to work with an al-Hura that we create. It's not going to work that way. It failed in Iraq. It's not going to work. What we should be doing is working with Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya. Those are the guys that actually can reach these people. And we ought to work with other Arabs that know how to handle social networks, not so much more than we do. We know how to, obviously, we created the social networks. We created Facebook and all that. But know how to talk to their own people. And there are enough people out there that are terrified of ISIS that would work with us. But that, again, needs a concentrated effort that we just haven't made. Now, finally, on Homeland Security, if you look at what we've had one major incident in 14 years, Boston. If you look at the European Union as a whole, or even Western Europe, they've had 4 major incidents at the same time. 2 in Paris, 1 in London, and 1 in Madrid. And, of course, lots and lots of smaller incidents, stabbings, the hacking of the head of a London policeman, or stabbings of Jews in Paris. Lots of that stuff. Why? Because we're more serious about Homeland Security than they are. Simple as that. So they need, if the Europeans don't want to have more trouble, they need to keep doing what they're doing right now. They shouldn't, find this last guy, this 9th guy, or whatever he is, and say, okay, we did the job, now we go back to normal. It's not normal. We can work with them. We already do. We could do more with them. But it's up to them. I think there's only so much the United States can do for other people. And finally, the end of the day, it's not going to be us that bring down ISIS. ISIS is just the latest manifestation of an upsurge in Islamic extremism that comes every couple of 100 years. The Mahdi in Sudan, the Almohads in Spain and Morocco. And this is nothing new in that sense. Well, how do those guys disappear? Partly by external force, but partly by what goes on internally. There's no way that ordinary human beings who aren't completely mad are going to support ISIS indefinitely. It's just not going to happen. What we need to do is be serious about containing them, I agree entirely with Bud. You can't put a time limit on these things. You can't announce when you're getting out. These, remember, the Middle East, they have long memories. They waited out the Crusaders, whom they consider us to be now. The Crusaders had a kingdom. They had families. They were there for over 100 years. And then they were kicked out. And I'm not saying we need to fight 100 years war, but for God's sake, don't have deadlines and say that by the end of my presidential term, we're going to be out of the Middle East. Guess what? We're not going to be out of the Middle East, because a president can't give a speech and expect the world to jump just because he gives the speech. I'll stop there.
Thank you, for inviting me here, and I will go down through some of the thoughts I've had, which are independently, in some ways, very similar to what you've already heard. And I want to make sure, I wanted to make sure as I thought through this that I really looked at the question for the panel and the conference, which is, U.S. combating the Islamic State is a new strategic blueprint needed. And emphatically, my answer to that is yes. And is the Islamic State a threat equal or greater than al-Qa'ida for the U.S. and the international community? And again, emphatically in my mind, yes, absolutely. And then, best practices, what do we do? Clearly a very timely discussion in light of the Paris tragedy. And these are some of the key developments as I framed my other comments on these questions. And the first one is that when the U.S. backed away from its own red line on Syria after Assad used chemical weapons on his own people, that was a strategic event. And then, as has been said much more articulately than I can, the Iranian nuclear accords took center stage as a U.S. strategic objective over the objections of Gulf Arab states, Israel, and in some case others, and decoupled Iranian support for Hezbollah and Assad and others in this nuclear power arrangement. It's worth understanding, I think, too, that the U.S. was very slow to do the few things that we have done in this business of confronting the Islamic State until the Yazidis were attacked in Sinjar about 14 months ago. From my perspective, there wasn't any mystery about the Islamic State prior to that, and I don't think in the region there was any mystery about the Islamic State and all of the evil that was embodied within that. But the U.S. did little or nothing until that particular circumstance. Since then, the U.S. has approached the fight incrementally using small numbers of marginally effective airstrikes with an almost zero collateral damage tolerance risk. There are about 3,500 U.S. advisors in Iraq. That number might be slightly off. Recently, 40 or 50 special operations troops were approved, and then I understand that 50 more will go to Syria, very small numbers. We speak of containing the Islamic State, but in reality, the means do not speak to that in any meaningful way in my mind. It is unclear, I think, to almost everybody what the U.S. strategy actually is, to go to the question that started the panel. For me, a viable strategy is ends, ways, and means, with implementation plans and actions to achieve them. And I see no meaningful levels of that in U.S. policy, intent, or activity with regard to the Islamic State. Incremental U.S. tactical actions appear to be a modified and indecisive COIN sort of approach adapted from things we've done recently in other places. Europe is experiencing a refugee crisis, the likes of which it has not seen since World War II. It challenges European unity and maybe even the existence of the EU itself. France did not invoke Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. It invoked Article 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty, an EU solidarity clause. President Hollande will visit Washington tomorrow. I anticipate that his message to President Obama will be that Europe is being destabilized by foreign fighters in the migrant crisis while America watches. On Wednesday, he travels to Moscow to see President Putin. In the aftermath of the Paris tragedy, Russia and France have a common objective: to destroy the Islamic State. And the vacuum of U.S. strategic leadership created a strategic opening for Russia for the first time since the Cold War by ostensibly fighting ISIS while actually supporting Assad, legitimizing Putin and Russia in ways that will embolden Russia further in the future. Russia has succeeded in altering the perceptions of the world on its ability to project power. A wide array of weapons and capabilities are now being used to support Assad, and Russia is back after the collapse of the USSR. In the aftermath of the Paris tragedy, Russia and France have a common objective, as I said. Russian intervention potentially strengthens their influence with Israel, France, Turkey, Jordan, Iran, and the Saudis. They are operating from a base in Syria, and it is changing the balance of power in the Middle East. Russia either has already or is displacing the U.S. in the calculations of European and Middle Eastern governments. They are now seen as a legitimate player in ways that reward bad international behavior, not only in the Middle East, but in other places we're very familiar with. Assad is still in power. Iran wields growing influence as a genuine opponent of the Islamic State in the Shia world. Decades of U.S. regional influence in Europe and the Middle East are eroding, and no effective coalition effort is emerging at this point, absent U.S. leadership and commitment. This is how I see the Islamic State. They are much more of a threat than al-Qa'ida. They control substantial territory. The Caliphate as it exists now, so-called. They have real money and their revenue is increasing. They dominate the social media conversation worldwide compared to the West. Their recruitment efforts are strong and appear to be getting stronger. The migrant crisis enables greater access to Western targets. They are becoming a truly global effort by self-affiliating with other terror organizations. They operate networks of sustaining functions, including criminal and financial activities that tie all of this together in a pretty functional way. They are truly an international organization with real capability in ways that al-Qaeda was not. They have suffered some tactical setbacks on the grounds at the hands of the Kurds and others in their core territory that are probably undervalued because of attacks like Paris and these affiliations that I spoke of. These setbacks are compensated for by attacks such as the Paris attack. I see this as strategic agility on their part and probably well thought out. They are correctly seen as an existential threat by the Shias. This governs everything that the Shias do, including and especially what they will tolerate from the U.S. or a U.S.-led coalition. The Saudis are leading a Gulf Arab coalition of sorts against the Houthis in Yemen with limited effect, and the Gulf states are waiting to see what, if anything, the U.S. will do with respect to the Islamic State. In Tehran, Saudi Arabia is seen as unable to fight and unable to defeat a fairly ragtag group of folks in Yemen, despite its advanced Western-made arms. So the Islamic State is creating global strategic effects, and to thrive needs to be seen as a global strategic force in order to recruit and raise money. On the need for a genuine strategy that supports U.S. vital interests, my thoughts. We absolutely must have a genuine strategy that contains the current Islamic State threat. It must consist of clear ends, ways, and means. It must have the next layers of operational and tactical planning to support it. Detailed integrated campaign planning followed by execution, assessment, and corrective adjustments. The actions identified from this must actually be implemented and seen to be so. Current enablers are woefully inadequate to the task. Much better use of air-delivered fires, rotary wing fire support, special operations forces down to the company level on the ground. Campaign objectives such as retaking Ramadi, cutting road networks, and Islamic State supply lines. Better equipment for an integration with Iraqi and Syrian Kurd forces. Special operations direct actions to target Islamic State leaders, local governance, Shia police capacity building, etc. This should be done with a globally coalition-driven effort with U.S. leadership. The U.S. should be prepared to commit U.S. combat forces on the ground to achieve its aims if it needs to. The present halting use of air fires and limited partner capacity with advise and assist efforts is far too little. Decisive operations will require coalition ground forces at some level of capacity and capability. All of this needs to be clearly and consistently articulated to the Congress and the public by U.S. civilian and military leaders. It should look at each country in the region individually with appropriate responses for each. There must be a viable concept of stabilization after combat operations. Refugee relief and assimilation should be a major part of the strategy. There must be a global coalition that counters the flow of foreign fighters. There must be a global coalition that counters Islamic State financial support. There must be a global coalition that counters Islamic State messaging and information operations. All of this can be phased. For example, enhanced enablers immediately from a U.S.-led coalition. Go after the Islamic State on the ground. Integrate the Iraqi military. Over time, roll back the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and move the coalition back as local forces have the capability to deal with that. Keep the advisors in place, stabilize and withdraw over time with no deadline. Constant multi-directional pressure under U.S. leadership can defeat the Islamic State. We need to think and act globally with kinetic pressure on the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, a global counter-terror campaign against the outlying and affiliated terror organizations, and a global coalition that operates against the networks that tie ISIS functions together, namely information, recruiting, fighter movement, and financial capabilities, essentially breaking their global linkages while decisively engaging them in Iraq and Syria. Current efforts are minimal to the threat, unilateral, tactical, reactive, driven attack by attack on the West. We are going to have to get serious anyway. We ought to get started now. To answer the question, we are at war now. Ideologies create behaviors. These behaviors are clearly hostile to U.S. vital interests and our allies. These behaviors and those who execute them have to be defeated to protect ourselves and render the ideology ineffective. If the Islamic State is not being rolled back, they are winning. They are expanding with attacks and the addition of distant provinces, and that has to be stopped. And that is something that has to change, or this will just get worse and worse and worse and worse. We need to face that. Thank you.
Well, so far, we've looked at this from a strictly American-centric point of view and a specific political point of view. I'm not here to bash any administration. I think that's a waste of time. I don't think any of the past administrations, Republican or Democrat, pick your leader, pick your favorite, it doesn't really matter. They've been rather similar in their approach, similar in avoiding the initial discussions of threats. And when they have happened, I don't think we've yet had an effective strategic plan put together. So I don't see where one can fault one administration more than the other. And I'm trying to be rather generous in this. I do think there's some more problems that got us in this in the first place, but that's not why we're here. What I want to do is something a little bit different. I want to look at what it looks like from the regional perspective, but more to the point, if you're talking about it's an ideological battle, it's religious warfare, it's all about doctrine, nobody's touched on that. All I've heard is the tactical stuff and how many divisions and how long you might be there and who you have to ally with, and I'd like to challenge some of that, but I haven't really heard anything which is going to get to the fundamental truth. Is it about ideology? Is that what they really want? And how can you really look at what their goals are? Because I don't think we've hit it here. Is the real agenda, and I'm talking at this point from the Islamist perspective, you've all laid out an American perspective rather nicely, at least historically, but is it someplace in Europe? Is it here? Or is it something else and someplace else? And let me just remind you briefly that we're not just talking about Paris and Europe and what's happened, that a lot of this began in the mosques and streets and among the Shia community in particular in Iraq, in Baghdad, bombings in Beirut, which we don't pay any attention to. It happens all the time. So what's new? It's not Paris. Well, okay, it is Paris too. The crash of a Russian airliner, that should tell you something. Or to go back to Khomeini's time, he didn't like East or West. He damned them both, and that was fair from his point of view. We're forgetting the attack in Paris, not just on Charlie Hebdo, but on the kosher delicatessen. Who's the enemy here? And when is it acceptable to be upset? And when is it just, well, you got to expect that's going to happen? These things bother me very much because I think there is a certain lack of consciousness, if you will, or to put it more in the words that we've heard here already, Americans are tired of being at war. And we're sending the same military to fight the battles. Little has changed except for very recently, where we've seen some stark changes, you might say, in terms of maybe Russian support, but not totally. But I think to look at it from the other point of view, in each case, and again, I spent my growing up years in intelligence in part with the original counterterrorism center. That was so long ago, around Contra and all of those issues and hostages. But if you look at the planning, the kinds of attacks, what is happening on behalf of ISIS, in each case, the targets were chosen for their ability to produce shock and awe. Remember that term, shock and awe? Okay. And to target not high-value targets, but high value in a different sense. It's mass targeting of innocent people. It's tourists. It's the youth out for an evening of decadent fun out at the bars on a Friday night, out for a good time. They knew which sections of the city to attack, who would be where, when, so they could maximize the casualties, maximize the damage, and thereby maximize the attention they would get for their efforts. They don't want to take Paris, but why attack there? Because where else are you going to get the publicity? You're not going to get it by your attacks in Iraq and Beirut. Who's listening? If the Russians were foolish enough to enter the war to kill and are now choosing to kill those loyal to the Caliphate, they'll pay the price as well, and the airliner should be a good lesson to learn. But in all cases, it's the Caliphate or Daesh, ISIS, that claims a responsibility. You could say in the sense that they're more dangerous than al-Qa'ida, but there's something we're all missing, most of us here. We've forgotten about al-Qa'ida. We've forgotten about 9/11. And we've slipped back, and I'm a historian, basically, and I've studied American diplomacy and American history as well as the Middle East, which is my first love. But somehow we've forgotten what's happened, and we've gone back to that 19th century theory of splendid isolation, and that distance once again protects us. Whatever happened in 9/11? Did we forget that? I don't think we should have. The question for me is, again, why is Daesh putting at risk the gains it's made, very real gains it's made in Iraq, in Syria, and the very real presence that it's asserted in the peninsula against the Saudis and to the other Gulfies to a lesser extent, especially when the battle for and in the land of the Caliphate has not yet been won? Why risk needless exposure now? So I think that is the question. But again, Paris operations by Daesh confirm how successful, the reasons they were very successful in Iraq, and they could replicate themselves again, and it's what we need to think about, I think. Daesh has been so successful in seizing territory in Syria and Iraq because of its ability to recruit operatives who grew up there, who lived there, in the territories under siege, and who give their loyalty willingly. They're well trained to kill with no apparent fear. Why fear when you're promised paradise and you're promised it immediately? Is this a war? Is this where we get back into the war for religious values or beliefs, ideology? That's a gray area for I think most of us in this room anyway. But I think the point is that the key was sending back home what we in the spy world love to call moles or sleeper communities. People from there, they know the enemy, they know the strengths and weaknesses. Maybe for Iraq, they were Sunni Arabs who formerly fought for, who were members of the Ba'ath Party, fought for the regime, and many of them were, and have positions of power. They had that to some extent in al-Qa'ida, but nothing like what they have in ISIS, with one added exception. That if you try to apply, what I've heard here today is the application of a lot of old solutions. Didn't work then. I don't know that they'll work now, but I think that we need to look at how you challenge on the ground. We can't fight them in an ideological or an Islamic, on a theological sense. That's the battle for the Arabs and the Muslims to win. But I think the point is that the tactics that they've used, and they've used it in Paris as well as in Iraq, go back to the people who understand and know. The difference for Daesh is that you're not going to find defectors, because the punishment for anyone thinking of changing sides, as could be done under al-Qa'ida, doesn't really exist under ISIS. The rewards for martyrdom may be high, but the punishments for defecting or for thinking about questioning the caliphate, the punishments are also very high risk. They're death for family, for individuals, but this is not something that one can do easily or lightly, and especially since we did not carry through our promises once to help them normalize their place in Iraq, in the society that they wanted to be a part of. Don't look for them to jump at the second chance. So, same, gee, I had the same, oh, isn't that funny? So, why the shift? And I think in part they know that they're playing on countries where the intelligence services may be weak, but also they've had opportunities this past year that they've never had before. In Iraq, the opportunity came in the success in Syria, but in Europe, it comes with the huge flow of refugees beyond anyone's control, anybody's ability to put restrictions on, or even just to basically make lists to find out who is coming, where are they coming from, who are they. It's been too easy to overwhelm the system and to break through. And I think that there are probably a lot more, as everyone suspects, who have gotten through the refugee lines using that as their cover than we can think, and that is going to be a continuing concern. So why the shift? Some would say it's a measure of their success. I don't. Measuring success, by the way, is something we've heard a lot about what we can do, but I don't think we really have adequate measures for our success. It's not in body counts, and it's not in how many leaders or how many we killed today. We killed the number 2 in Raqqa. We killed the number 2 in How many number 2s can you have? They replaced them overnight because they have a well-trained and they have a well-organized and systematic controlled group so that it is easy for them to advance and replace. They have a lot of replaceable parts. For those of you who are interested in identifying and how many countries they come from and how many people and all of that, I let the think tanks worry about it. I don't want the military or my government or the intelligence community worrying so much about that they lose sight of the objective. And I have to tell you, as somebody who was an intelligence officer, I think it must be overwhelming to try to find it. I know that when I was doing the intelligence and my job was to cover Iran and Hezbollah and all of the terrible things that they were doing, the point was overwhelmed by intelligence and a lack of sharing. I don't think the community or the U.S. government has learned the lessons it should have from the 9/11 Commission. There still is a lot of rivalry, a lot of pride, a lot of I know something you don't know, and what is it? The pride of, I don't know, institution, whatever you want to call it. I know my agency was better than any other, but we also, the cult of sharing of information, it's not there yet. I don't know if it ever will be, but just the sheer volume is something which I didn't have to deal with. Not like we are today, where everything is in social media, and I don't even know what that all means. So let's let the think tanks worry about it and worry about the social media and whatever. But it is true as well that we are soon to be in our second generation of jihadis, or maybe it's the third if you go back to Afghanistan. They are suffering high mortality rates. But again, I think be careful with the data that you get. On the other hand, you could say that the reason they're being so active outside the homeland, outside the region, is because they failed at home and they need spectacular success and they need it abroad, in part because they need to win something and they need publicity. Unlike Dove, I think they have suffered some recent setbacks. They're certainly not gaining anymore. They have had to give up some territory. They've had some losses. I'm not saying that they were highly significant, but it's good news for those of us that are keeping our fingers crossed and praying that at some point the Iraqi military will get it together. They'll all fight. But we have seen that there have been some pushbacks. Loss of territory, the death of many top commanders and a lot of fighters, and there are reports of drying up of recruitment networks. What that means, I'm not so sure, but they've lost Sinjar to the Kurds, Beji to the Iraqi government and irregular forces. We've broken the road for their supplies to Raqqa, which is very important. Maybe we can successfully at some point now move on to there and to Mosul, but point is that they're no longer in the kind of total control they were. They lost Kobani in Syria and other territories. Ankara as well. We forgot the Ankara attack. That was huge. 160 some casualties. But again, it's easier to forget what happens over there than it is what happens in Western Europe, I suppose. And the change again in Russia's position, because now Russia finds themselves the target as well, which they didn't before. Now, let me get to something, the heart of what I wanted to say. What comes next? But more point, some observations and I think recommendations as well. We are looking at a very complicated set of relationships and alliances. We have friends of the moment. Remember, countries, governments don't have friends; they only have interests. And we have, as friends, governments that have opposite interests. Turkey is with us, but they're against us, because Turkey says it doesn't like ISIS, but it helped them in the past. But any enemy they see is always starts with a K. It's always the Kurds, and maybe we'll get to this other stuff later. I don't know. The Kurds are with us, but here I will disagree with something that was said earlier. The Kurds know what they're fighting for, and it's territory, and they've got the disputed territories in Iraq. They took them on the day that right after Mosul was taken, without a thought to the loss of Arab Iraqi territory, which they may or may not really care about. I don't think they do, but I do think they're out to expand from the base that they are. Remember, a lot of things were theoretically part of Kurdistan going back, if you go back 8,000 years or however many years. Their view of their history is not the narrative that everybody else follows. Now, there are two, I think, obvious trite observations here. Time is on our side. Time is not on our side, which is true. And hope is a poor policy. And yet you hear a lot of these things. Now, I can understand that Mr. Obama is a rational person. He doesn't like war, but then who does? Some like it more than others. Some see it as more effective than others. And there is a serious element. I think he recognizes it, not just within his party, but among the public in a whole, which says enough. And it is a mistake to announce withdrawal. Nobody will argue that. But on the other hand, in the system we're working in, everything he does is up for criticism, and I think he's probably felt that he has to explain that all very clearly, right? Without taking sides. I think you have to understand that. Now, I think more to the point is the battlefield has changed. So too must the strategy. We can't fight these wars, and you pick the war, but we're not fighting in Europe. We're not fighting tank wars. We're not fighting with the kind of battles we fought in the past, and that the military pretty much is still trained to fight today. I may have spent 15 years at National Defense University working for the think tank and through the Pentagon, but I don't pretend to understand military doctrine, and if I did, I probably wouldn't agree with a lot of it. Anyway, the point, I think, is that the challenge is far greater now, both militarily and diplomatically and politically, than right after 9/11. I'm quoting here from somebody I used to work for who's writing a lot on this at Brookings. That's Bruce Rydell, for any of you who know him, and who said, "We now face an enemy that has more sanctuaries and more operating space and territory that it owns than ever before. The battlefield is much larger than ever." So they don't just threaten and operate from ungoverned space like al-Qa'ida, but they have a territory. They have a caliphate, which did not exist before. And that all has special meanings. It looks like a state, Daesh. It acts like a state. It walks and talks like a state. They even, and you'll get upset when I say this, they have a rule of law. But remember, Iraq had a rule of law under Saddam Hussein. It wasn't our rule of law. It wasn't what we would accept or what we would see as any kind of an acceptable rule of law. But they're ruling by something which holds a population in check. They even want to coin money. They must be a government, you would say. Now, we've had a lot of talk about the role of religion, religious doctrine, and ideology, but we haven't even come close. But I ask this. Is it about the rejection of Western democracy and freedoms and power, which comes from the people? Or is it about rejection of democracy and freedom because power comes from God? And in that case, you even have to ask yourself why Iran doesn't measure up in many ways. There's something about being a theocracy, a theocratic state, where the power comes and who is in charge here. So, yeah, this is about political and religious correctness as well as power. Now, I just want to get through a few more points. Is that a good or no, not good? Yeah, don't.
No, that's the way, so.
Okay. I don't like the implications here in terms of what's changing in our minds about imposing new restrictions on assistance to refugees and legislation to ban them, or what is it, to call for a delay. I don't like what that means. It's not America. It's not what we represent. And I will bet it's not, if that were to go into effect, most of us, if and when, and this has happened before, we might not be here today. Think about that a minute. There is no sanctuary for those determined to destroy us. These kinds of things are not going to defeat Daesh. I think that military actions can establish a contest that's more favorable to a political solution, but no-fly zones, safe haven for refugees, is not going to be applied immediately, even if it is approved, and it's not going to provide immediate relief for the refugees, for those fleeing, whether they're still in country, and half of Syria's population. In other words, 11 million Syrians are either in refugee status abroad or in IDP, internally displaced status at home. How do you get the hope and help to them? Let me end with two other alternatives that I've been seeing recently, and one is comes from Princeton, so it must be good, right? And this is by a Saudi scholar, Gulf scholar, who says ISIS is an expression and symptom of the political disenfranchisement and humiliation that many Sunnis, in particular Sunni Arabs, feel in today's world. And he goes through the standard and comes out and he blames Western intervention. In other words, they feel bad because the U.S. occupied Iraq and defeated Saddam. And we are in a lot of other countries. They don't like that. They blame he blames, or he says the Sunni Arabs blame, their own governments because not only has it brutalized its non-Sunni Muslim as well as its Sunni populations, all those monarchies, he's thinking, and the provision of a poor education. People have not been well served by the wealth their countries have. Their governments share and sometimes don't share. Not developed or delivered on problems of economic development. We've heard about that. That's the so-called liberal argument, whether you believe it or not. He blames a civilizational sense of the Arabs. They feel bypassed by history. There is an element to this that we don't really put too seriously, but we don't think much about how they feel about their own history and the humiliations they feel in the past, while others are progressing. Can you blame the religion for that? Can you blame the politics, the regimes they live under? There's a lot of blame to go around. But these problems, which are structural, which are serious grievances, can't be remedied militarily. And I'm not sure that the way we're set up to deal with them can do it either. So the answer that my friend Bernie Heichel finds is that the answers for the solutions have to do in an ideology that sanctifies violence as the only means for Sunni empowerment and glory. We're not equipped to deal with that, he says, but it is interesting that the effort, which must emerge from Arab and Muslim communities, that there are increasingly important voices that are engaged in the battle. Of course, Heichel looks at Saudi Arabia as being part of the answer. Because they are courageously speaking up against the ideology of jihadism. And I said to myself, and I am speaking to you again, these are my personal views. I don't work for the government and haven't for a while, but I would say this anyway. I'm not real comfortable with that kind of a solution. I'm sure there are many people who aren't. There is an alternative thesis to this by another academic, equally well qualified, who's long looked at Islamic culture and politics and history, and he sees that this long-range goal that the answer does not lie with the Saudis. He says if you're looking at the ideology, and I'm ending with where we began, if it is about the ideology, understand what it means by a caliphate. Why is that such an important symbol? Why is this the first time in the modern history of these movements, these extremist jihadist movements, in the early 21st century, that a caliphate has been declared? Al-Qa'ida never declared a caliphate. Of course, it never declared territory, but that's not necessarily a requirement. The caliph must be an Arab, must be a descendant from the family of the Prophet Muhammad. Jihad is an obligation of all Muslims. It's not about democracy. It's not about free will. It is about your obligation as a Muslim, and when called upon to do jihad, and he reminded them in his speech in Mosul in Ramadan last year, I'm calling on all Muslims to fulfill their obligations for jihad and to come to our territory, come to the homeland, because his major enemy, his major goal is not in Europe, doesn't want to take over Paris, doesn't want to, they have opened up parts of Syria and Iraq and gotten rid of a little bit of the Sykes-Picot line, don't want to have borders, maybe not. But the target of much of this is the heartland of Arabia itself. It's the Saudis? Well, they're going about it in a funny way, you might say. But the king is the symbol of this. Remember, the Al Saud do not have any religious claims or pretensions. They are the guardians of the two holy mosques. They're not clerics. They're not religious, except that they obviously profess strong religious beliefs as good Wahhabis. They've only been, the guardians called themselves as their title of legitimacy since 1970. Ooh, that's not so long ago. So this is not an ancient historical thing. Yeah, they're anti-Shia, as the Wahhabis, as ISIS, as al-Qa'ida, and as all of these Sunni Arab Salafist groups. That's fine, but nobody's sure. They may be anti-Iran as well, but maybe they're not in the long run. But again, the feeling is that ultimately what ISIS wants to do is to take control of the Islamic Caliphate in its proper place, with control of the holy cities and the Holy Land, the homeland of the Prophet. But it's not about the Prophet. It is about God and about belief. And again, many who look at, I haven't heard anybody say this today, but the beliefs and the practices, the success and the quick success in many areas of the ISIS is because it's speaking to Salafist Islamists who follow Wahhabi tenets in Iraq, in Syria, and many of the countries. But what frightens them in the end is the theme among the ISIS that it's against the control of one family, one mosque, one kingdom, against Saudi Arabia, against the Al Saud, and against their form of Wahhabism. So let me conclude with this thought. Looking at it from the perspective of the region and trying to think that, we do have to work together on this. In 5 years' time, Saudi Arabia may either help defeat the Islamic State or it may become it. But this is not going to be anything which is going to be ended simply or quickly.
All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some issues here today. My focus primarily be on threats here in the U.S. and selected responses. So we've had more the macro and focus on international issues. So we'll deal with U.S.-based Islamic threats and then selected responses, primarily in law enforcement realm, but some others as well. I'll cover the issues accordingly. So U.S.-based individuals have actually been successful in traveling to the Islamic State. Those that have attempted to do so but have been unable to reach their goal. They've been arrested often at airports or stymied during other sting operations. Then other types of assistance, material support that's been provided to the Islamic State or other followers. Then focus on individuals that have undertaken attacks here in the U.S. or have attempted to undertake attacks either as lone wolves or otherwise, and then some responses, those we actually have in existence, just amplifying a number of those. So I'm focusing on 1 through 4 using primarily case studies. Obviously, you're probably familiar with. We've had about 250 Americans have traveled to the Islamic State. A number of them have been killed fighting on behalf of ISIS. A number of them have come back, about a dozen or so. Others we don't know about their whereabouts. We have about 60 individuals the past 2 years have been arrested here in the U.S. in relation to some ISIS-related plots. The federal law enforcement is investigating ISIS-related plots and individuals in all 50 states. There are anywhere from about 900 to 1,000 investigations of violent jihadi actors here in the U.S. So with that as background, we'll go through some of these case studies. First of all, we have an individual named Abu Samara, based at one point in Boston, studied at Northeastern University, is now believed to be a principal media propagandist and for the Islamic State. He also traveled with another individual named Mahana to Yemen several years ago trying to join AQAP, but was unsuccessful, came back, interviewed by the FBI, within several days decided to travel to Iraq and Syria and join precursors of the Islamic State. Here you have another individual who actually studied at Florida International University. He graduated, then traveled to Islamic State, joined ISIS, was killed while fighting on their behalf. So we have those that have traveled, joined the group one way or another, have either fought or have been or were killed or providing some other type of assistance there. Here we have a convert to Islam who subsequently was radicalized, based in Minnesota. He also traveled and joined the Islamic State and was also killed in battle, along with another individual from Minnesota, originally of Somali extraction. So here are a number of case studies of individuals that are based here in the United States and decided to embrace the tenets that are dictated or disseminated by the Islamic State and decide to join forces with them. Sort of a different twist. You have a woman who was radicalized in Alabama. She decided to take some tuition money that her parents gave her, and instead of paying her tuition, she traveled to the Islamic State, met her an individual there from Australia, a foreign fighter, and her foreign fighter husband subsequently was killed, and she's based now in Raqqa and is involved in recruiting, trying to recruit other women, particularly in the U.S., to join the Islamic State. Then a number of other case studies of individuals that tried to join the Islamic State. Here you have Shannon Connolly, based also in Denver, was looking at trying to find her path, looked into a number of different religions, subsequently ended up converting to Islam, then became radicalized online, looking at various propaganda and videos of Anwar al-Awlaki, AQAP, and some ISIS-related material, interacted with a few other ISIS-linked individuals, came to the attention of the FBI. The FBI met with her and said, you're on the wrong path, and if you continue to do so, we're going to prosecute you for providing material support or attempt to provide material support to an FTO. Nevertheless, she continued on her path, was arrested at Denver Airport, ultimately pled guilty to attempt to provide material support to an FTO, was sentenced to 4 years in prison. And here's another nice couple, also based in Alabama, had their whole life ahead of them, and of course, instead they decided to have a honeymoon in the Islamic State and join ISIS. So they too were arrested at an airport. So I'm trying to demonstrate that here in the U.S. you have a number of different individuals that are linked or inspired, otherwise trying to participate in this pan-Islamic caliphate. Here you have another individual also converted to Islam, also radicalized, was trying to decide whether to join ISIS or al-Nusra Front, ended up choosing ISIS, also was arrested at Houston airport with his wife and 2 kids with the goal of taking them to Raqqa and having them participate in the Islamic State. So again, U.S.-based actors. And then another example here of Muhammad Khan. He was arrested at O'Hare Airport along with he was I think 19 at the time, with his sister and brother that were under 18. And he also recently pled guilty to attempt to provide material support to an FTO. The goal was to take all 3 of them and try to join ISIS. This is a picture of their parents showing up at the airport. Another example, this time in North Carolina, several individuals, again in this case as well, converted to Islam, then became radicalized. And their goal was to travel separately. One didn't have enough money. He was trying to gather some funds with the goal of ultimately joining and fighting for the Islamic State. So here we have a next set of examples is a shift of other type material support. You might be familiar with the material support statute for terrorism, 18 U.S.C. 239B, that prohibits providing material support either to an FTO or providing material support in relation to specific terror act. Here we have a group of Bosniaks, Bosnians of Muslim background that's immigrated here to the United States, and they were in collusion with another Bosniak who was based here in the U.S. and then decided to travel and join the Islamic State. So they provided him funds and military supplies, and they were prosecuted in relation to the material support statute. Included in this mix is a husband and a wife. So we've seen also family-affiliated terrorism as well. Here you have a group of individuals from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and 2 of the individuals had planned to travel to the Islamic State, participate as fighters, and if they were unsuccessful, they said they wanted to undertake attacks here in the United States. Here you have an individual based in New York, and his goals were manifold, including plans to attack U.S. servicemen that returned from overseas, as well as at one point also looking into plots against some Shia targets in Western Europe, as well as trying to send funds to individuals that were planning on traveling to the Islamic State. He ended up sending money to 2 confidential informants, as well as 1 individual in Yemen who ended up traveling to the Islamic State. So this last category of actors here in the U.S., you have individuals that have either planned to undertake attacks here in the U.S. or were successful in doing so. A number of these were undermined through sting operations. Here you have 2 cousins based in Illinois. The individual on the left was part of the National Guard, and their goal was to have Jonas wear the uniform of Hassan and undertake an attack against Joliet Armory in Illinois, while Hassan was planning on traveling to join the Islamic State and fighting on their behalf. Here you have another sting operation. Mr. Booker also wanted to join the U.S. military, was unsuccessful in doing so, and a sting operation with the goal of conducting a suicide car bomb at Fort Riley, Kansas. Another sting operation against some of these individuals, just from the way they look, appear to be, nonsensical, but again, their motivations were real. In this case, this individual was also in a sting operation, had planned and was essentially in the process of dropping off a knapsack with what he believed was explosives on a beach in Florida. So we've seen the role of these sting operations quite successful. Here again, another sting operation, an individual radicalized primarily online, and his goal was to use pipe bombs against the U.S. Capitol, as well as use semi-automatic weapons and kill at the U.S. Capitol. This other set here, these roommates based in New York, they articulated various jihadi ideology for several years, and they interacted also with undercover agent, and they wanted to replicate the use of attacks here in the U.S. and saw that there's no need to go and travel and join the Islamic State. So they wanted to replicate the attacks of Tsarnaev brothers, but actually do it in New York. And lastly, one of the last case studies. Here you have two individuals that planned to undertake propane gas tank attacks in New York. And when law enforcement did the search of their home, Mr. Mamouni utilized this knife over here and tried to stab numerous times federal law enforcement official. Fortunately, the law enforcement official was wearing body armor. So with reference to some of these successful quote-unquote attacks, you have Zale Thompson was radicalized online, looked at various jihadi content, and looked at the call for lone wolf attacks at the urging of Mr. Adnani, spokesman for ISIS, and decided to take a hatchet and try to kill several NYPD 2014. After almost splitting the head of one NYPD officer, he was shot and killed. Here we have an individual based in Oklahoma that ended up decapitating one of his co-workers and trying to almost decapitate a second before he was shot. Some have characterized this as workplace violence. He had a history of looking at various jihadi content, including ISIS. I mean, if you look at the modus operandi of ISIS in part of beheading, again, it's not surprising. In this case here, these two actors plan to attack the exhibition in Garland, Texas, where they showed negative cartoons, essentially the Prophet Muhammad, as you may recall, and they were killed when they interacted with the off-duty police officer. An individual there based, this individual based in Arizona assisted them. So again, we have individuals that are inspired by ISIS. Apparently, at least one of them was interacting with several ISIS individuals, urging them on, etc. And in this case as well, also in Boston, you have a connection here of families as well. Mr. Rahim was approached by several law enforcement officers and in relation to investigation of him and these two other folks planning on undertake attacks here in the United States. They wanted to decapitate an individual based in New York who organized the Garland, Texas exhibition. Mr. Rahim said he wanted to accelerate, drop that plot, and instead attack the men in blue, and obviously attack law enforcement. And as he approached law enforcement, he tried to stab them, and he was shot and killed. So those are some of the individuals here in the U.S. that have been involved with actually traveling abroad or trying to travel abroad or providing material support or other types of support or planning or successfully attacking here in the U.S. Here are some responses. I think we're already utilizing these responses, just a question of amplification. So additional information gathering and sharing both here and abroad. Again, some of these are pretty straightforward but need to be reminded. Use of the JTTFs, Joint Terrorism Task Forces. We have more than 100 here in the U.S., fusion centers, more than 70, and leveraging federal, state, local law enforcement. Also, increasing the use of community-oriented policing in vulnerable communities. There are various pilot programs that exist in that realm. The use of traffic stops and calls for service as a modality for interdicting terrorists on their way to respective plots or on their way back. The use of sting operations, I mentioned a couple, utilizing undercover agents or confidential informants, using very aggressively the material support statute, which has been done. Also various plots in relation to utilizing weapons of mass destruction or IEDs. This notion of returning foreign fighters, keeping track of individuals. There's also a database of foreign fighters. It's put together by Interpol. We have more than 50 countries contributing. We have several thousand fighters in that database. Some cases, countries are not aware that these foreign fighters, that individuals actually traveled abroad. So that's sort of an empty data set. Then leveraging the suspicious activity reports, which law enforcement is utilizing, their nationwide dissemination of that data. Also in the finance realm, leveraging the suspicious transaction reports, currency transaction reports, the material submitted to FinCEN, which is a unit within the Department of Treasury. Then looking at the connection between traditional crime and organized crime and terrorism, expanding the physical information security. Obviously, you have both critical infrastructure here and abroad are targeted as well as soft targets. Implementing some of the lessons learned that we've seen in types of targets that ISIS is attacks they're undertaking in the West and elsewhere, what modus operandi, looking at disparate profiles of some of these individuals while not doing racial profiling or religious profiling. As was mentioned by some of the speakers, being aware of some of the fluidity that exists in this realm, the non-static nature of these threats. And lastly, a few other points, increasing outreach with the private sector, nonprofits, non-governmental organizations. This was mentioned as well, the use of counter-radicalization here and abroad. Again, it's far from simple, but various steps have been taken to improve that issue. Mobilizing religious leaders against extremism, and then utilizing different de-radicalization programs. We've seen some examples even of individuals that pled guilty to provide material support for terrorism. Instead of jailing them, you have one individual in Somali background in Minnesota. A judge actually sent him to a halfway house. We'll see how that works out. So two last points. Recognizing the threats and response, as was mentioned by several other panelists, is going to be very complex, many-fold, and multi-year. And I'd want to perhaps underscore this issue that while there are significant threats, we also need to avoid paranoia and xenophobia. I think that's also quite important. All right, thank you for your time.
How come you asked me to speak when we're already done? We're 12 minutes late. Why do you want me to talk? No, I just want to say that for all the panel members, including those that have gone, which I personally thank, but want to thank everybody for another great panel. And clearly, you know, Sun Tzu and the other great strategists of history, they all talk about knowing your enemy. I think they're only half right. We also have to understand our enemy, and clearly we don't. We don't understand that this is really a radical jihadist movement. We don't understand the long-term consequences. We don't understand what the different caliphates were trying to do through history, and where and why. For example, a caliphate that tried to conquer the Mediterranean, or the one that tried to conquer Spain, etc., etc., etc. My good friend mentioned the Wahanabis and the like. That goes back to 1724, when the guy in Saudi Arabia, who later that family became the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, cut a deal with the Wahanabis, and they've been bad ever since. They actually got their start in the 1200s, when the Mongols whipped their butt in Turkey and the like, and they decided to do something about it. So this goes on and on and on and on. And we've got to understand the enemy. And any strategy has got to be comprehensive. It's got to be economic, it's got to be political, it's got to be societal, it's got to be military, it's got to take all the elements of national power and influence. It's got to be regional, as you've heard, and the like. And you need to determine how you're going to win and how you're going to be successful. And of course, we have to educate the American people and our allies on like what this is all about, because only then will you have the ability to stay there long enough to get a decisive kind of environment that the free world needs to survive. So it's very difficult, but I agree we shouldn't be pessimistic all the time and the like. And on the military side, we ought to quit telling everybody what we're going to do, and begin to, and that's the beauty about special forces and like, because they'll at least be more secretive. And we ought to clobber them when we feel like it, where and when and how, and stop this business of no boots on the ground. We ought to outlaw that phrase. We ought to determine how to deal with propaganda and the like. And we need to understand that the enemy is very, very good. He's extraordinarily, as we've heard, extraordinarily adept at using the media and the like they're on cyber. They actually teach all their people how to deal with us, how to act with us, and how to say good things to us, and say our kind of saying. They're very, very good at this, and this shouldn't shock you. Any enemy that we've ever been involved in my experience and the like, didn't have much, but what he had, he was awfully good with it. And so these are just some of the things we ought to consider. And finally, there is no silver bullet. There is no one strategy, one idea. It's a comprehensive kind of things, and some will work and some won't. And we have to be flexible and adapt and all of that kind of thing. But again, I want to thank all the panels and the colleagues, and you get more exciting every day. That's another way of cutting me off. I got sounded out.
We're done until next week. We have another seminar. Thank you very much.
I always said, we were not very good.